Yo, what's up, guys? We're back again with another YouTube video. Today, I wanted to take some time to kind of reflect on some of the stuff that we saw in the Battle for Azeroth expansion, as Shadowlands is going to be coming up soon. And so, with that being said, I wanted to create a top 5 BFA raid boss video. Basically, this is going to be contingent on the bosses on Mythic. And there are a lot of things that end up going into fights. More often than not, end tier bosses will be ranked higher than some of the mid tier bosses just because of the complexity or the decisions that are made for these end tier bosses. End expansion bosses are normally going to be seen in a bit higher regard, just as a general rule, but there are also some things that will probably notably be missing from the list. Just a couple of fights that I really was not a fan of, even though they were end tier bosses. So with that being said, without further ado, let's jump straight into the video. So also another part of the criteria that I'm going to be ranking these on is like almost comparing the bosses in a vacuum. So sure, some of these fights are going to be like mid-tier bosses. Like number 5 is going to be Rawden. It is a mid-tier boss, but again, we're comparing these in a vacuum, where like I'm not giving it like a better ranking just because it's a mid-tier boss. So with that being said, like I already said, number 5 is Rawden. I felt like the priority damage balanced with individual mechanics on Rawden itself was actually a really strong point of the fight. Just having to allocate certain cooldowns like Combustion, like Infernal, to like the orbs and to the ads themselves, I felt like was actually a pretty solid stand on how Rawden should have been done for the first phase. And on top of that, there were different Bloodlust timings based on how much damage you had. Towards the end of the expansion even, whenever you ended up getting more corruption, the fight got easier because you were able to skip more phases, and like bloodlusting on pull became a more viable option. Whereas earlier on in progression, you would take longer into phase 1 and then have to bloodlust phase 2 to be able to get the execute on the boss. So those were that was definitely like really nice, having different bloodlust timings. We even saw guilds with the infernal exploit at the beginning of the patch being able to bloodlust on pull and kind of skip orbs that way. So that by itself was something that was interesting. So yeah, the huge burn towards the end of phase 2 was also something that was really interesting about Rawden, especially for like a mid-tier boss. I felt like the burn by itself was tuned really well. You couldn't have like multiple players be dead going into the phase 2 burn whenever you push the boss past 40%, especially early on in progression. On top of it, it actually had some interesting mechanics for healers. I felt like the damage that was being dealt to the party and to the group was pretty high in phase 1. And then once you started getting into phase 2, you of course had the mechanic where you couldn't top people. So you had to manage health pools really well to make sure that they didn't get killed by the debuff. But at the same time, you couldn't just completely top them. So managing health pools and health potions was super important for Rawden as a fight. And that's why it has reached a number 5 spot on this list. I feel like for a mid-tier boss, it is actually a really, really solid fight, and I enjoyed it a lot. All right, so at number 4, we have Zukul, which I felt like was a pretty solid penultimate boss. Definitely better than Carapace and Stormwall Blockade, for example, of other penultimate bosses. So some things that were interesting, I felt like the Delirium phase was a cool mechanic, but it was kind of a shame that more classes couldn't do the Delirium phase. Basically, rogues, hunters, shadow priests, demonology warlocks were really the only people who would go down to the Delirium phase for any extended period of time, due to their amount of self-healing or immunities being able to come out of the Delirium phase to be able to dodge some of the mechanics that were prerequisites for that. So those classes were kind of needed for the Delirium phase to be successful. And as a proxy, like, you were reliant on your rogues and your hunters to be able to deal with the Delirium phase well. So a lot of your prog was contingent on them doing that mechanic correctly. I thought that the fight generally had solid movement around the room, where dodging the tentacles was critically important. My raid didn't have too many issues with tentacle dodging because our raid leader as tank, he moved the boss, I felt like, in a pretty solid manner, and would call out like where you were able to move just miles in advance so that you were never really in a bad spot. Some of the other things I thought were cool about the fight is having to allocate significant cooldowns to be able to meet certain damage checks early on in progression was really nice. So towards the end of the fight, which is part of the problem that, like, some of the downsides of the fight is that the fight had like global combat timers for like the tentacle slams and some of the other mechanics. So you had to push the boss at a specific time, but early on, those specific timings and those checks were actually kind of hard to reach. So making sure that you allocate certain damage towards the mirror image, making sure that you had certain cooldowns allocated for the delirium phase, like vendettas or whatever, on the image that spawns down there as well. And then on top of that, being able to push the boss in a timely manner were some of the things that made Zukul a little bit more interesting. The downside, again, like I said, phase 1 was kind of sleeper once you had too much damage, because a lot of the stuff was on global combat timers. That was definitely a pretty big drawback to Zukul, but overall I felt like some of the initial progression stuff whenever you were initially progressing Zukul was a pretty solid fight. All right, so number 3, probably the most controversial one on the list, I have N'Zoth. Basically, the phases with Psychus I felt like were actually interesting, but the upstairs phases where you repeatedly killed Bashers and Corruptors was kind of boring, and you ended up doing it for like, I don't know, 5 minutes long. But again, I feel like these fights are in a vacuum, and as a end expansion boss, N'Zoth isn't the best. Like, I think that there are some end expansion bosses that are better, like Argus or Archimonde, but I feel like whenever you take a look at some of the things that were designed for N'Zoth as a whole, it does almost deserve the number 3 BFA boss spot, right? So allocation of damage on the boss and Psychus and Bashers at specific times is actually kind of cool to math out towards early progression, but like getting back to those phases and like really feeling like you made meaningful progression could have been problematic from time to time. The Magni Portal phase was actually cool for what it was, but for mythic only mechanics that we've seen from end expansion bosses, it was kind of underwhelming. But whenever you look at it in a vacuum, like the Magni Portal phase was actually it was a pretty interesting mechanic. On top of that, having to specifically allocate the necklaces whenever you were using them to make sure that you were stable on sanity for a long period of time, I felt like that was an interesting mechanic. Unfortunately, I didn't feel like sanity was normally your biggest downfall or your biggest detriment as a resource, so it didn't matter all too much. But like, you had to make sure that you had enough necklaces, like enough sanity going into the Psychus phases. You had to make sure that you had enough to be able to soak the Thought Harvesters. Again, speaking of the Thought Harvesters though, 10 immunities was not great. I felt like that actually was one of the biggest points of contention for a boss that I've actually seen in a while. Having 10 immunities for that fight, it was not okay, I felt like. But on the upside, the damage check on super early kills was really tight, and it was good to see a burn like that. I do remember like the world first stuff. People thought that the boss died at 25% because there's absolutely no way that you were able to burn the boss all the way down to 0. And it was like one of those things where it's like, how the hell are you even going to burn that much damage? And then just like seeing guilds like really starting to optimize their damage for the boss and like really start to push, and then like you could feel like once you started getting the dragon proc on your cape and a lot of those other things like corruption week to week, like the damage burn was really, really tight. And then once you started getting more corruption and more week to week power gains, the damage check became a little bit less daunting. So number 2, Uunat. Uunat had instant one-shot mechanics with touching the circle to the totems to be able to remove the buff. I'm normally not the biggest fan on how these mechanics function normally, but Uunat was designed in such a way where they felt rewarding. I remember like the initial iteration of these was like the Star Augur style mechanic, where you had to run to another player to be able to get your debuff removed. I felt like having to run to a item that you preset on the ground around the room was a substantially better way of being able to remove the debuff off the player, especially whenever like that was the mythic mechanic for the fight. On top of it, it had a really tight damage check pre-nerf to the point where you would have people like, I don't even know, guilds were running like 14 warlocks, but at the detriment of that, it kind of made people not want to step into Crucible of Storms because they saw how tight the damage check was on Uunat pre-nerf, and they were like, we could just kind of take a mulligan for this one, because they didn't have Elemental Shaman was kind of required for this fight. There was a fuck ton of Warlocks that you really wanted here. So that kind of pushed people away from wanting to do Unat. On top of it, it was just like a 2 raid boss instance. And just as a point of reference for people being pushed off, even trying Unat, the Alliance side never even finished the Hall of Fame for Unat. Like, that's how hard this fight was and how few guilds actually went in to try to attempt it. But in isolation, the fight was actually pretty sick because it had tight damage checks in phase 1, 2, and 3. Like, all 3 of those damage checks were based on how many circles you ended up getting, how many sets of lasers you ended up getting, and like how many ad spawns you would get in phase 2. And just how tight those damage checks were and having to beat certain mechanics was actually what made the fight fun. And that is why Unat is actually held in such high regard, because it is definitely one of the best tuned fights that we've seen in such a really long time, because Blizzard really was on point with how much damage guilds were going to be able to have whenever they came into Crucible Storms, because it was a tier after Jaina, and it wasn't like you weren't actually getting any tangible power gains, and they tuned it as such. So that's why the fight was really fun, because of how tight these damage checks were. On top of that, coordinating range movement in phase 3 to be able to drop the puddles, while at the same time, like, the room is getting increasingly smaller and smaller once you end up getting into phase 1, 2, and 3. And so that coordination of dropping the puddles to make sure that you didn't run out of room and you were able to walk around the room to be able to drop your debuff on the obelisks was quite nice. Downside, though, having sacrificed people off with the leech circles was not great, but I felt like it was a pretty good adaptation. If you were like, some people with the leech circles would have to stay alive for a little while, and they would have to be able to use the crown to be able to reset. I don't remember what it was. They would have to use the crown to be able to reset something, but you were basically sacrificing them whenever they went and did that. And the leech circle, having to sacrifice them was not great, but utilizing them in a way where they were able to use the crown was a pretty solid mechanic. So with any ranking, we have honorable mentions next. So the first of honorable mentions, I put Restless Cabal. I actually really like the difficulty of the damage check super early on, very similar to how Unat was, but it was a really, really hard fight. Managing your the debuff and coordinating dispels was paramount to your success on the fight, to the point where it's like, if you didn't manage your debuffs well, you weren't able to actually kill the fight because you were not going to be able to have enough damage. But that was the mythic mechanic, was coordinating that debuff, getting up to 10 stacks of it, and then being able to just burn these 2 bosses. Part of the problem, though, is that you had to have like really good use of utility and kick rotations. There was a ranged tank player, typically either a Moonkin or a Mage, that were tanking the bolts from one of the bosses, and then on top of that, you had to coordinate kicks on those 3 Sunken Denizen style ads, and that was a lot of kicks. And I think everybody had a player in their guild who attempted this fight that would always miss their kick, and you would just be like, why have you missed your kick 3 times in a row? I'm incredibly upset with you. And it would just completely wipe your raid if you missed a kick, because you had people who had the debuff still that had 90% reduced health, and they were not ready for an ad cast to go off. Or actually, no, it didn't heal the ads to full. It blew them up, and if you had multiple blow up at once, you had a debuff. And if you had multiple blow up at once, you would just completely wipe. So you had to make sure that you staggered which ad was blowing up when. And if you had people missing your kicks, it was just really stressful, and it made you want to rip your hair out. So it came down to too much individual play for me to really enjoy that much. But if I had to like give like a 6th or 7th place honor, Restless Cabal would probably be in there, because it was a sick fight, but it was like too much individual play because like the kicks I was saying. So the other honorable mention that I felt like I wanted to add here was Mithrax, the only boss from Uldir that I would have even put here. Mithrax was really heavy priority damage with specific allocations of when you're using your cooldowns on weapons. These are some of the things I actually really like in fights, whenever you have to kind of math out who is using Arcane Power, who is using like Breath of Syndragosa, who is using Celestial Alignment, like what cooldowns are you using on which weapon spawn, like that kind of thing. And because the weapons were like getting them down before the 3rd cast was really, really important for Mithrax. So making sure that you had that great precise allocation of how much damage you really needed for the weapons, and then putting everything else back into the boss was super nice, especially since the weapons spawned every 1 minute. There was also interesting intermissions, especially with like the rock cheese, where you would like run back and forth baiting the lasers and then like spawning ads on top of those rocks. I felt like that the intermission by itself was pretty cool. You had your tank run off to another side with like a healer to do some of their own stuff. The biggest downside of this fight, and the reason that it's probably not in the top 5, is that it was too melee unfriendly. Basically, the circles that ended up spawning made you only able to run like 2 or 3 melee at the absolute most. And like also the laser coming out of the weapon was not the easiest to dodge, especially as a melee. And so the fight just ultimately became too melee unfriendly. And yeah, that was part of the problem with the fight as a whole. Like it did eventually end up getting fixed to where the circles no longer spawned on melee, but whenever you were initially progressing the fight, it was just a little bit too much, and that's why it wasn't on the top 5 list. All right, and number 1 is Jaina Proudmoore. All right, so basically the 2 intermissions, phase 2 and phase 3, were all, I felt like, pretty well designed from a coordination perspective and like damage checks that were designed in phase 3 and phase 2, with how you had to drop the artillery barrages on the barrels and make sure that you were constantly damaging Jaina, making sure that the barrels got broken at really precise timings. And then, of course, during phase 3, that was like that historic burn where your healers are even trying to like just barely scrape together and keep you alive, where you can't run 4 healers because the damage is not healable, and you're trying to beat the 20 stacks before your raid entirely gets ice blocked. The first intermission early on was kind of annoying for healers, but as progression went on, the phase felt a lot better. It was a lot of movement for 3 healing, and the damage from the ramping dot in conjunction with the movement actually ended up being pretty daunting for a lot of the healing specs. But as people started getting ice blocked less and people started playing the fight better, that phase felt a lot better. The downsides of Jaina is phase 1 on the boat was actually just kind of annoying. Mostly the reason that was annoying is because the spell queuing was kind of bad on that fight, where you would sometimes get like the frontal. When you would get the boat that you had to like fire the cannons at wasn't consistent from pull to pull. Whenever you had the ads that spawned was also not consistent from pull to pull. So the first phase on the boat was not great, but ultimately it wasn't like a deterrent enough to where it ended up costing Jaina the number 1 spot. Phase 2 and 3, those pushes damage-wise were some of the best in the expansion. I felt like that phase 3 push, like I was saying, where you could not 4-heal the fight because you would not have the damage available to be able to do that, was absolutely just the most like cool thing ever. And then like it was the most insane healing and damage check, while you would occasionally have to sacrifice players due to the artillery barrages coming down. Or I don't remember what it was called. It was like called like Stormbreaker or something like that. Some like major AoE cast where you would literally like sacrifice people off to the side. Like I can think of countless times where your raid, like the boss is at 5% health, or it was like 8% health, and your raid just gets dusted because the tank accidentally like aims the frontal at you, or just things like that. And also, on top of that, Jaina was the first fight that was actually punished with Bloodlust, so you would end up like Bloodlusting in the phase 2 intermission, because that was just like the only time where ice blocking Jaina was not going to just cost you a ton of time. And so all of those things together, combined together, actually made Jaina one of the most well-rounded fights, and ultimately why I ranked Jaina number 1 for Battle for Azeroth raid bosses this expansion. So with all that said, I think that you guys probably noticed that I left out Ashara and Gahun from this ranking, especially since I did say that end tier bosses are normally going to be better. Honestly, was not a fan of either Ashara or Gahun for multiple reasons. Just did not find those super fun as bosses. If you guys have difference in opinions, please leave those down in the comment section. I actually want to see what you guys have to say. Was I wrong about N'Zoth? I feel like that's probably going to be the biggest point of contention, but again, I look at these bosses in a vacuum. I felt like N'Zoth was a very complete fight, even though it wasn't the best end expansion boss that we've ever seen. So if you guys have any difference in opinions, leave those down in the comment section. Remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video.